Good afternoon. My name is Errol Southers. I'm the Associate Director of Research Transition here at the National Center for Risk and Economic Analysis of Terrorism Events, also known as CREATE. We're a center of excellence for the United States Department of Homeland Security, and we're based here at USC. We're an international and interdisciplinary research center, and our mission is to improve the nation's security through the development of advanced models and tools for the evaluation of risks, costs, and consequences of terrorism. I'd like to start, first of all, by thanking all of you for coming here today. Most importantly, many of the people seated here in the front who are members of our Government Advisory Committee, who we meet with several times a year to share the research that we're working on, and more importantly, to inform us as we endeavor into projects for the future so we can face some of the challenges that they have in their respective domains. We are committed to research transition. Congress obviously funds our center, as do you, the tax-paying public, and it's very important that we become leaders in research that allows us to make America safer and more secure. We created this speakers series so we could have a forum for noted experts to share their insight to our colleagues, our friends, and the American public. We wouldn't be able to do this without the support of our president, Max Nikias, Dean Jack Knott, the dean of the Saul Price School of Public Policy, and Dean Yanis Yortsos, the dean of the Viterbi School of Engineering. I'm also honored today to have a couple of other people here that I'd like to acknowledge. Our veterans, many returning home after fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, possess incredible skills and experiences. Today, we are very privileged to have Jacob Wood and William McNulty, the co-founders of Team Rubicon. Could I ask you gentlemen to stand? And stay standing, if you will. I'm going to embarrass you a little longer. Team Rubicon is a nonprofit organization that unites the proficiencies of our veterans with medical and professionals to rapidly deploy emergency response team into disaster relief situations around the world. Since they created Team Rubicon in January 2010, they've engaged hundreds of returning veterans, positively impacting thousands of lives in places domestically and internationally, such as Maryland, Missouri, Vermont, Burma, and Pakistan. How ironic today that we would have Fran Townsend, who's obviously a CNN superstar, but these two gentlemen and their work at Team Rubicon, amongst the numerous awards that they have been granted, they are also had the distinct honor of having been awarded the CNN Heroes Award. They serve on several committees for organizations such as the Clinton Global Initiative and Habitat for Humanity. They're seated with Rob Florkowski. Rob, if you could stand. Rob is a graduate of our Masters in Public Policy program and a former Iraqi war vet, and I'd like all of you to thank them for their service and give them another round of applause. As I mentioned, the CREATE Distinguished Speakers Series has been ongoing now for going on 3 years. You can see some of the very extraordinary people that we've had over the last several years, and today's speaker is no less worthy of being added to our collection of incredible people. But first, what I'm going to do is share some of our work here, CREATE, if I may. I'm very fortunate to have an office 2 doors away from probably one of the nation's leading economists, and his name is Adam Rose. Adam Rose serves as coordinator for economics for CREATE. He's a professor of economics in the Price School of Public Policy and acting director of USC's New Energy Institute. Much of Professor Rose's research is on the economics of natural and man-made disasters. He's currently a principal investigator on a National Science Foundation grant to estimate the economic impacts of risk amplification following terrorist attacks and several other significant projects. First, I'd like to acknowledge Adam here, if you wouldn't mind standing, Adam. And now what I'd like to do is give you a sampling of Professor Rose's work in the following video.
Hello, I'm Adam Rose, and I'm Coordinator for Economics at CREATE. I do work on economic consequence analysis, and at CREATE for the last several years, we've done pioneering work to broaden the concepts and methods to do that kind of analysis. And today I'd like to share with you some of our findings for an application to 9/11. The first part of economic consequence analysis deals with the impacts that take place on site to businesses directly affected. Many of these businesses lose income and reduce their employment because of that attack. In addition, however, there are many multiplier effects off-site and throughout the economy. For instance, businesses that are affected have to cancel orders for inputs in their production processes. They also are unable to provide products to their customers. And in essence, all of these effects continue to ripple throughout the economy. CREATE has also done the pioneering work on two important refinements to the economic consequence analysis framework. The first of these is resilience, and this refers to our ability to reduce the losses from a terrorist attack by using the remaining scarce resources more efficiently. And again, let me illustrate how this works in the context of 9/11. The economy of the United States and the New York metropolitan area were highly resilient. And a good example is the fact that there were 1,100 businesses operating in the World Trade Center area just before the attack. However, 95% of those businesses simply relocated nearby, thereby saving a good deal of the economic activity that would have otherwise been lost. In fact, we're able to measure this resilience precisely by comparing the avoided losses by this business relocation to the maximum potential loss. Now, of course, there was some loss because it took time for these businesses to relocate, but we were able to measure that 72% of the potential losses were reduced by this activity. In addition, there are major steps taken by the federal government to reduce losses that also contribute to resilience. This included shutting down the stock markets for a couple of days, and also the Federal Reserve making more than $100 billion available for interbank loans to maintain liquidity in the U.S. financial system. Our second refinement refers to behavioral linkages in the economy. For example, after 9/11, there were many heroic acts, but many people made decisions thereafter out of fear. For example, we found that there was almost a 2-year reduction in airline travel and related tourism after 9/11, and that this was responsible for more than 80% of the total losses from that event. The results of the 9/11 study have significant implications for policymaking. First, the government and individuals can take greater steps to ensure that they are resilient. That is, that they improve their resilient capacity. This includes stocking up on inventories for businesses and supplies of households, being flexible in their production processes and the way they carry out their daily lives. With respect to behavioral linkages, this means risk communication is especially important. The government should take careful steps to accurately report events, to remedy or clean up sites that have been affected, especially biological, chemical, or radiological agents. In addition, the government should take every step to reassure the public when everything is in fact all clear.
As I mentioned earlier, we are a National Center of Excellence, a collection of more than 20 institutions across the country and the world that are engaged in looking at economics and looking at risk. I've been very fortunate since I've been here at CREATE the last 6 years to have worked with our Vice President, Randy Hall, who's now the Vice President of Research, Detlev von Winterfeld, who was our director at the center when I came on board. And as I mentioned earlier, Dean Knott and Dean Yortzos have been extraordinary in terms of their support. But I'm really happy now to be able to work for Dr. Stephen Hora. Stephen is the director of CREATE. He's a research professor of industrial and systems engineering at the Viterbi School of Engineering and a professor of public policy and management in the Saul Price School of Public Policy. He's an expert in decision and risk analysis with particular interest in the use of subject matter experts, statistical modeling, and the analysis of technological, natural, and environmental hazards. So having said all of that that's geared to the academic community, one of the most fun times I've had with Steve was asking him last year if Matt Barkley was going to stay here in his senior year. And believe it or not, if you get him offline, he'll tell you about all the decision analysis that went into that decision that Matt made. Anyway, I've had the pleasure of working with him since his appointment to Create. Our success is due in large part to his vision and his leadership. It gives me great pleasure and an honor to introduce our director, Dr. Stephen Hora.
Thanks, Errol. That is a true story about Matt Barkley. I gave it to my class in the Saul Price School. It was a MPP class, Master of Public Policy. And they did a bang-up job, but the conclusion was that Matt Barkley should have gone pro, but he didn't. He's back here at SC. What do you know? Well, it's my pleasure to welcome you, to welcome the members of our Governmental Advisory Committee. And once again, we're here for our Distinguished Speaker Series. Today we have Fran Townsend. And Fran is the Senior Vice President at MacAndrews and Forbes Holdings, Incorporated. Ms. Townsend was a corporate partner of the law firm of Baker Botts LLP. Previously, she served as assistant to President George W. Bush for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism and chaired the Homeland Security Council from May 2004 until January 2008. Ms. Townsend is on the air as a contributor for CNN in the areas of counterterrorism, national and homeland security. She spent 13 years at the U.S. Department of Justice under 3 administrations, those of George H.W. Bush, President Bill Clinton, and President George W. Bush. Ms. Townsend is the director and chairs the compensation committee of 3 private companies, company boards, and serves as director of 2 public companies. She serves on numerous government advisory and nonprofit boards. Ms. Townsend chairs the board of the Intelligence and National Security Alliance and is a member of the board of the Bipartisan Policy Committee. She is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. Now, I apologize for reading this, but I could not put all that to memory. It's quite an impressive list of accomplishments. So I would like to welcome Ms. Fran Townsend as I think this is our 9th distinguished speaker now.
So I always worry that when somebody in my introduction gives all these jobs that I've had and the dates and how long I've been at them, I thought everybody in the audience is doing the math and expects me to be about 130 years old by the time I walk up here. Look, it has been an enormous, great privilege for me to have a career in public service. And when I left government, I made up my mind that I wasn't going to go work for anybody who was not going to let me volunteer some time back. And so I've managed to maintain a presence in the law enforcement and intelligence communities. I serve on the CNI and the DNI's advisory boards, DHS's, and I also serve on the NATO advisory board. So before I start, I'm going to say to you all, be thinking, I've had this long and wonderful career. But I'll encourage you to think about if you have questions. There's nothing that's off limits as long as it's not classified, and I'm happy to answer it. And my favorite part of these is the Q&A. So I hope that you will think about what it is you'd like to ask me when I finish speaking. The other thing is I have a promise I've made to myself when I left government, and that is every time I speak, I begin every public address by saying, 1, to those both past and present who are here in the audience and around the world as we sit here in freedom having lunch, thank you for your public service. Thank you for keeping the country safe, whether you're in military, the law enforcement, intelligence, We wouldn't be here if there weren't people who really cared and willing to put their lives on the line. And so to those who serve, to those who have served, and to families who grieve those who have been hurt or lost, I say thank you. Now, let me start by saying I've broken kind of my talk down into two sections, if you will. One are, what are the coming national security issues that I think any new president, regardless if it's President Obama's reelected or there's a President Romney, it's not going to matter. The issues are going to be the same. The approach may be different, the policy answers may be different, but they're going to have to be thinking of these things. And so my first basket is sort of substantive areas that I think the next president is going to have to address. And then I thought the second part is more the international part. I'm going to take you on a little bit of a foreign policy tour in the Middle East, because I think that too is going to be an area that the next president is going to have to address. First and foremost, we've seen a long and rancorous debate in Washington on cyber capability. If you picked up the paper this morning, you saw that there is a private company has identified yet the fourth state-sponsored worm that has been used, this time against systems in Lebanon. You would have also seen that Google has paid a more than $20 million fine for privacy violations. What they used information gleaned off the Apple Safari browser. When you look at the cyber issue, you know, it's funny, when I talk to kids my son's age, he's in high school, they think that, you know, I don't understand why this is new to you. Why is it that policymakers in Washington find this whole cyber area so confounding? Well, let's think about what this means. It is the backbone of the military logistics system. It is the backbone of the government information system, and it is responsible for billions of dollars in commerce, not to mention, not least of which, are our daily financial transactions. I'll bet most of the people in this room, myself included, I don't write checks to pay bills anymore. I do it all online. And so the importance of our confidence in the cyber-based economy is critically important. How we defend that and how we use that offensively is actually quite important. So how do we want to base the rules for that road? There is, even when I was in government, there was an ongoing debate about the offensive use of cyber capability. When is your use of cyber? I just said in the paper today there was a fourth virus identified as part of what's called the flame worm, being a state-sponsored tool. We don't know whether or not that's true. It's been reported in the papers. But let's assume for a moment that it is a state-sponsored tool. Anything that a government uses offensively, they better be prepared to defend against, because you'll have an adversary out there who, even if they don't possess the capability today, will reverse engineer it and turn it back on you. It's critically important that this is one of these, you can't catch up. You must be ahead of this. We have some of the most brilliant minds around in the government and in this country. But this is a place where I am absolutely convinced we must have a public-private partnership. Here in California, you are blessed to have a think tank in the RAND Institute that was at the forefront of public policy for the Defense Department. And I would say to you, the cyber area, you heard I'm involved in the Bipartisan Policy Center. I chair this Intelligence and National Security Alliance. Many think tanks in Washington have taken a whack at the cyber issue, various pieces of it. For my money, what we need is a RAND. We need a RAND that is absolutely devoted to the cyber issue full time, that looks at both the policy implications, the legal implications, and let's talk for a moment about the privacy implications. I don't think that we've had enough public debate about the privacy implications of cyber. Again, you know, I go back to my oldest son. They put everything on Facebook. They let everything hang out, and they believe at his age that privacy concerns are a vestige of their parents' generation. They're not as concerned about what the government knows. They don't much care. I don't think that's going to be true when he has children. And I do think that we need to really have an honest conversation, not just about what's the government's capability to use that information, my cyber activity, against me or to understand about me, but what is also the commercial world doing? Because I think very few people understand just how much information is collected about your buying habits and about what you read, the sorts of things we view as incredibly private, to understand and to sell that data back to entrepreneurs, commercial entities, so that they can target you, to sell you things. It's not that it's wrong. What I'm suggesting is what we need is to have a real public policy discussion that we haven't had, frankly, up to now. And what's required more than anything is a group of people, both government and private sector, where in the private sector, much of this capability resides, the intellectual capital, if you will, to think through these on a full-time basis. And RAND, frankly, is a good example of how we've done that before. I think the next sort of substantive policy area, I think will not surprise you, and that's counterproliferation. We think of that, weapons of mass destruction, frankly, after the intelligence failure in Iraq give it a bad connotation. But when you think about the capability that Iran is trying to amass and to build, you understand that counterproliferation, what that means is what are all the things, it applies whether you're talking about terrorism or weapons of mass destruction, what are all the little pieces that go into building a massive capability? I think most people, when you think of a counterproliferation effort, think about what are those component pieces. Is it yellow cake? What is it? Are there lathes and metal? What are all those things? Well, we do target them, and we should target them. You target shippers. You'll see interdiction efforts on the high seas. We should follow them. But perhaps the most effective place, which is the least sexy place, is what I call the soft middle. Every one of these proliferators require lawyers, and they require bankers. I think I can say this as a reformed lawyer. I don't do that full time anymore. These are people who do not plan to go to jail. These are not people with a suicide bomber mentality. These are people who are entrepreneurs and making money. And so we found it incredibly effective in terrorism. It will be equally applicable in counterproliferation. Identify the bankers, identify the lawyers, because they'll, as we would say, flip. They will turn and give you evidence that allows you to work your way up the food chain. They are the soft middle that you need to use to target. I met with General Barbero, the head of JIATO, that's the Joint IED organization in the Defense Department, and talked to him. We've made extraordinary gains in countering IEDs, but to get to the next level, he was asking about how do you attack the network. We did that very successfully in Iraq, and I said to him, you get to a point where you have to attack the soft middle to take the infrastructure away from the bad guys. The next area I think we need to pay attention to, because I really worry, is biodefense. In a time of fiscal constraint, you run the risk that programs like BARDA, that is the Biomedical Research Department at HHS, will not get funding. It's been many years, it's been more than a decade since the anthrax attacks. We like to believe that smallpox would not be weaponized and used against us. But in the end, if a terrorist organization or a state decided to launch a bio attack, the only people who really have responsibility for preparing this nation for that are at the federal level. That's not going to happen at a state level. The states will look to the federal government for the planning. And so we must be very careful not to, as we have to make choices, look, in every household, my own included, we've had to make financial choices. And there are things we no longer will do because we don't think they're a priority. That's true in the federal government. We're in a time of fiscal constraint. States and the federal government will have to do that. But we must be careful. There are certain things, if we let them weaken, are very difficult to build back up. The thing that takes the most time to build back up in the federal government, and I'll give you an example, are people. So to the extent you're cutting people that you may need in a crisis, that's not a light switch you can flip. You don't get a sniper or a special operator by flipping a switch and bringing them in. It takes years of training. You don't get a case officer who's effective and can go out and get you the intelligence you need to have the military use that in targeting by flipping a switch. It takes years to do that. So after the end of the Cold War, there was this elusive thing referred to as the peace dividend. We cut our resources to the intelligence community. We had half the case officers as a result of it on 9/11. And it took us literally my entire rest of my time, post 9/11 in government, the 8 years of the Bush administration, to rebuild the intelligence community. And so when I hear about budget cuts, and I hear about sequestration, and I hear about cutting the head count in the Department of Defense for active duty military, I say to myself, please God, the people who are going to make these decisions, they weren't there when we had to live through trying to build it back up. Be smart about what you're going to cut. I will tell you, my one screed, a little bit off topic, on sequestration. I have zero patience. I mean, I now live and work in New York because I lost patience for Washington. This is a subject on which I think is criminal. I think it is criminally irresponsible. It's not a reflection. I'm not pointing fingers at the executive branch, Congress. I blame all of them. I'm agnostic about blame. I just want them to solve it. This is crass politics that's going on. And frankly, they're playing with the safety and security of you and your families. And we as the American people ought to just be outraged at the childish behavior. I'm convinced the only thing anybody cares about is getting reelected. Look, I am not a political, as you can tell, not a political person. I was a career person my whole professional life. But I do think that this is a very dangerous game. I'm going to hit three quick topics that I think are worth mentioning in a substantive area. Information sharing, we've made great gains, whether that's vertical, local, state, federal, or horizontal, CIA, FBI, military, but we're not where we need to be. This is a topic when the new administration came in and they invited me, it was a privilege, they invited me into the White House. I said if the White House and the President's staff didn't continue to push information sharing, it wouldn't happen. That's not because the technology exists. It's perfect. There are brilliant programmers who can write the rules for a computer to share whatever you need shared. It continues to be a cultural and policy issue. And I think the President was very disappointed when he found the underwear bomber. There had been information in the system that hadn't been adequately shared. Every administration deals with this. This is not a Republican or Democratic issue, but we need to continue to demand that of our public servants that they share it. The war of ideas, this is, across two administrations who have tried desperately to sort of turn the terrorism counter-narrative in our favor. Look, we're on the side of the angels. The fact that we haven't figured out how to get our message out across the government in a consistent and persistent way is unfortunate. And the Professor Rose, who mentioned, whose video we just saw, I care about critical infrastructure and resilience. And one of the things I very much advocated when I was in the White House, it didn't happen, but efforts like yours in terms of the economic impact can make it happen. And that is, if you want to encourage preparedness and resilience, you must tie it to incentives. I have always believed in the power of the sort of economic analysis you're doing here at CREATE, because I think if you tie that preparedness to economic incentives, such as reduced insurance rates, if you could get insurers to reduce their insurance rates for companies who stockpiled countermeasures and who had resiliency and redundancy in their information systems, the companies would then do it. And we would have a better, stronger private sector so that the government during a crisis could focus on those who couldn't do for themselves. And so I applaud your work. My last comment sort of on substantive areas is I really think at the moment the greatest threat is complacency. I will tell you, more than 10 years after 9/11, I think lots of people think this threat's gone. Bin Laden's dead, Al-Qaeda's weakened, all of which true. That's all good news. The problem is you still have groups like Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and Yemen, You've got al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb along the Mali-Mauritania border. They're not going away. And to the extent we let our guard down and are unwilling to continue to innovate and keep our commitments to the security of this nation, we will be sadly disappointed when there's another attack. There is absolutely the problem of the homegrown threat, and I'm happy to talk about that. I think that's a particular concern when you see things like Aurora, Colorado, and the Sikh temple shooting. Those aren't necessarily extremists, but you have domestic violent attacks, and we need to understand better what the federal government can do to support state and local efforts, what we can do in communities. The federal government is not good at a state and local level. They're not in the communities like state and locals are. And so what they need to do is understand how they can better support you. Okay, so quick, I promised you a little bit of a tour into the Middle East. I'm going to start with Syria because it's the thing you hear the most about. It's the thing I've been on CNN talking most about. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 20,000 killed in the Syria conflict. And I said long before the number was that high, my fear has been and remains that Syria will become for our president what Rwanda became for President Clinton. Why do I say that? The numbers are not Rwanda yet. And with luck, they won't be before the end of the Assad regime. But the problem here is, there is no question, if I was sitting in the White House, Syria is a much more difficult problem than Libya was. I had been to Libya when Gaddafi was there. I understood the state of the infrastructure there. I mean, Libya was, for many reasons, a tactical and geographic advantage for NATO and for the United States. That is not true of Syria. Again, for a host of sort of tactical reasons and capability, Syria is a very, very complicated problem. You've heard in the news there are somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 dozen chemical and biological weapons sites. Some of them have been moved by the Assad regime. The Assad regime is crumbling. Sanctions there have been effective. I think the ones you will see, there was an announcement today of increased sanctions, which I view as largely ineffective. They do not add any additional teeth because the transactions that today's sanctions announcement are meant to target are ones that are already targeted by earlier sanctions. But no one thing, no one tool of national power alone is ever effective. So when anybody says to you, well, we're doing sanctions, if we're not doing something else, it's not going to, I can assure you, sanctions alone have never worked. Now, there are things the governments do that they don't talk about, right? There's covert action. That's clandestine activity on the part of your intelligence service. I'm willing to assume where in many of the problem areas like Syria, I assume that the government is doing something in that area. So you'll have financial measures you can take, you have intelligence measures you can take, but the question is it enough? I will tell you, I find it, I think as most Americans do, very difficult to watch pictures of hundreds and thousands of women and children massacred in Aleppo and Homs and not see the international community do something about it. We can do more in terms of humanitarian aid. We can do more in terms of refugees. We don't have to act alone, and I'm not suggesting we should. This is a very fractured tribal community. We have hopefully learned some lessons from Iraq. We understand that fractured tribal communities require indigenous organic knowledge, but we have allies who understand there very well. The Saudis have close ties into Syria, as do the Qataris. We've seen public reports that they are helping, but it's obviously not enough. And here's my big fear. Lest it sound to you as though I'm making sort of just a moral argument about why we should go into Syria. I am a realist at heart. And the fact of the matter is, what happens when a vacuum is created, and we know this from places like Yemen and Mali and Mauritania, when there is a vacuum and a government that cannot exert its control over its own territory, al-Qaeda will fill that vacuum. There have now been reports that al-Qaeda is offering the rebels arms. If you were desperate and hungry and your family was being murdered, you would take weapons from anybody who offered them to you. And so we see this vacuum being created, and if we do not address the vacuum and give some support to the rebels while they're fighting and they have a chance, we will lose them, and we will lose them for decades, and we will have created another sort of Afghanistan pre-9/11 where al-Qaeda is embedded in that territory far better than we are. And so we have a national security imperative to get Syria right. From my perspective, I think we've already waited too long, but I think it is vitally important that we act imminently. I think we have to be honest. The other thing about Syria is for this generation, frankly, what Vietnam was earlier. It is the nexus of a geopolitical strategic battle. You've got Iran is Syria's greatest client. Syria has provided space and support for Hezbollah, also Iran's greatest client. There have been attacks around the world, Georgia, Thailand, all over the world, these one-off assassination attempts targeting Israelis and Westerners. There's also been Iranian nuclear scientists targeted for assassination. And so there's this shadow proxy war being fought. The Russians have obviously picked a side. They've sold more than $4 billion of weapons to the Syrian army. I think you can't read that as they're supporting Assad. What they're doing is supporting the Syrian military. And they will support the Syrian military whether it's being run by the Assad regime or by the rebels, right? Because this is business for the Russians. This is not, there's no sense of loyalty about it. This is really all about the weapons sales. China has also picked a side and has been obstructionist in the UN Security Council. I think we've got to give up the effort at the Security Council. It is absolutely ineffective, and it's been used by the Assad regime to buy time. The U.S. is, of course, on the other side of this, along with our Western allies in Europe, as well as the Gulf. And that's a good thing. The people most affected by all the changes going on in the region, not only in Syria but in Egypt, are Israel. And so let's talk for a moment. That kind of brings us right to the problem that is looming, which is a conflict with Iran. Make no mistake, I think from all the public reporting we see, it is pretty clear that Iran has continued their program. It looks from public reports that the U.S. And Israeli intelligence agree that they've continued their program and made some progress. I don't think there's any doubt, again, that sanctions are having an impact. But that's not the test. When you hear somebody say to you in any one of these countries that sanctions are having an impact, the answer is that's misleading. Even if the answer to that is yes, the right question is, are sanctions changing behavior? Because if they can have an impact, but if they don't change the regime's behavior, that is, in Iran's case, their nuclear program, then they're not effective, right? Whatever impact they're having on the Iranian people, that's not the point. What we want to do is change behavior. I don't know what will happen, just like anybody else. But I do think that the president is in a very difficult position. With the timing of the election, I think pressure is going to increase on him from Israel. Pressure will continue publicly on the administration to have some action other than sanctions. And I think that the Iranians are not going to give up their program. And so I don't know how that plays out. We are working very closely with our Arab allies. As you've seen in the papers, we are working to have military sales for a missile shield that includes Saudi Arabia, includes Kuwait, and the UAE. The UAE has been an extraordinary ally, as has Saudi Arabia in the war on terror. But this is their backyard, and they sit on more than 60% of the world's known oil reserves. And so we have an interest in making sure that they're able to get that oil out. All sorts of efforts and planning underway because of the Straits of Hormuz. And so our naval assets are very much involved in anticipating and planning in case there were a mining and a closing of the Straits of Hormuz. I haven't even mentioned yet Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan. Iraq is a fledgling democracy, and they are very much influenced and permeated by Iran. That's a threat to us. Iran has been very active in Afghanistan. I would say to you, undermining our efforts there, and they will continue to do that as we proceed through the drawdown. Pakistan is a confounding problem for every administration. Again, this is not a Republican or Democrat problem. I dealt with it, they're dealing with it now. They are disappointing and at times duplicitous. That said, they get hundreds of millions of dollars in aid from us because we don't want to create the very vacuum that I'm concerned about in Syria. Sometimes you continue the military aid because what you don't want them to do is look to somebody else who will be even less friendly to you. And so we have to look at the carrots and the sticks to try and incentivize Pakistani behavior. And let me wrap up with a little bit on Africa. Somalia, again, multiple administrations, it has confounded and continues to confound. The problem is that they now have more than ever exported their own problem, their terrorism problem, across the Red Sea into Yemen. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, I think, continues to be the single greatest threat to our security. These are the people who brought you the computer cartridge bomb in cargo planes, the underwear bomber that one Christmas years ago. They're not going away, and they continue to come at us. They have probably the single most sophisticated and capable bomb maker in all of Al-Qaeda. And so that continues to be a threat. And then there's Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. This is also the Burkina Faso group. This has become a real problem, mostly because it's out of the public eye. They're in an area that is very remote. It is very far from U.S. policymakers, and it's one of those things because it doesn't press up against a daily threat to us that doesn't get the attention it might. My colleague at CNN, Erin Burnett, showed real courage in going out there and trying to tell that story. And I talked to her before she went. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb really does represent a threat to the fledgling effort of the transitional government in Libya. Again, these people, Al-Qaeda looks to exploit ungoverned spaces or weakly governed spaces. It's exactly what they did in Yemen. It's what they're trying to do in a place like Libya, and it is what they will try and do in Syria. And so as we look at Africa, you have to really worry about the efforts there and our effort against it. We have to support local law enforcement and intelligence. We must work with them. We must help them build capabilities so they can address the problem themselves. But we can't turn a blind eye to Africa because it will come back to haunt us. And Egypt, the attack on the Sinai against the military was horrific. I think it very much threatens the new government there. I think I'd put me in the camp of more skeptical than the current administration about the president of Egypt. I'm one of those who says people don't really change their stripes very much, or certainly not completely. And so I do worry. And I worry, but more than that, I worry about the inherent tension that is between this Egyptian president and the Egyptian military that has provided the stability of that country. Democracy is a messy, messy proposition. It was by the way, it was violent and messy here. And we forget that. We have elections and they're very partisan and people say mean things about one another. But there was a time when it was more than that. And we need to understand that democracy in other parts of the world is going to be messy and violent in the beginning. And it may never look like it looks here. One quick story, I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East, most of it in war zones and also in Saudi Arabia. And so I was talking to women in Saudi Arabia, and the big issue you hear in this country is women can't drive there. It's just horrible. And, and I didn't say that, but the women said to me, do me a favor. When you go back, senior administration official had been out there and made this argument in the Bush administration that women should be able to drive in Saudi Arabia. This woman said to me, you know what, women everywhere are the same. I care about my husband and family's safety, I care about their education, and I care that they're healthy. Those are the three things I care most about. If I can get those three problems solved, driving is not at the top of the list. And by the way, in a country where my husband can have, yes, 5 wives by law, the fact that he has to come home and drive me around, not such a bad thing. But it was a good, funny, it always gets a laugh, but I will tell you, you realize the fact that that wouldn't fly here, I can't imagine not having a car and being able to move around. It's not necessarily the same in other places, and we need a little humility is not a bad thing when you have suggestions about how people ought to have policy changes. So I think we're going to open this up, and Errol's going to ask questions or moderate. I really encourage you. I'm very open. There's nothing you can't ask me, so please feel free. Thank you.
So we are recording, obviously. I'll ask the first question. I just ask that you raise your hand. Let me acknowledge you. I will probably repeat your question so we can get it for our broadcast, and then Fran will answer it. So the one thing I'd like to start with, and first of all, thank you for a wonderful talk. Talk about the work you did as it relates to state and local engagement in the national security apparatus, particularly in the intelligence community.
It helped. The beginning of my career, I worked in the DA's office in Brooklyn, New York. So I had a very personal connection to state and local officials, and in fact, often said, I learned how to conduct an interview from the homicide detectives in, the ghettos of New York. So I understood what state and locals had to bring. I got to the West Wing of the White House, and there were on the Homeland Security Council, there was not a state or local cop as a representative. And we were making all these policies that really affected them. So one, I got somebody inside the West Wing on the Homeland Security Council staff who was a state and local. Second, I talked to the department about making sure that the Department of Homeland Security in the NAC, in the command center, they had a state and local representative because in a crisis, the feds were not going to be there likely. They were going to have to deal with somebody at a state and local level who knew how to press in on that command structure. And then the third, and this was to me, surprisingly, the most difficult, at the establishment of the National Counterterrorism Center, I wanted to make sure that there was a state and local representative, or more than one, at the NCTC. Interestingly enough, there was real resistance by the feds to having somebody inside the tent. Their concern had been that the state and local would pass information outside the JTTFs, outside the established system, and really resisted it. It ultimately wound up to be the president's decision. We now have state and local reps who have to get clearance, who go through the clearance process and get clearance. But it's important for a whole bunch of reasons. One, of course, as I mentioned earlier in my talk, the feds are not in local communities. And so we need to be able to pass information to state and locals who are, to tell them what we're looking for and what we see, and to be able to pull that information back. We need to understand what are the daily needs and requirements of state and locals, so we're inside the federal government trying to gather that information and push it out to where it can be most useful. And so I was actually quite proud that working both at the National Counterterrorism Center, at the White House, and basically at all levels. There's a state and local rep in the FBI now. So it's now over time become far more usual, but I think there's still a lot more work we have to do. So for our viewers, 2 questions. Was our intervention in Libya responsible or partly responsible for the terrorist haven that now exists in Mali and along the Mali-Mauritania border? Second, what are we doing at the federal government? It's not we anymore, I'm not there, but what does the government do to try and garner the lessons learned of prior interventions like Iraq and Afghanistan to ensure that we don't make sort of mistakes or learn the lessons, if you will, of prior interventions? So on the first one, I would say to you, I think it's absolutely false that the Libyan intervention was responsible for the Mali-Mauritania problem. And that's because I knew when I was in government, this is well prior to the Obama administration, well prior to our intervention in Libya, a group called the GSPC, Combat for Preaching, and the Salafist Group for Preaching and Combat. It's in French, so those initials aren't quite, my words aren't in the same order as the initials, which was an Al-Qaeda affiliated group, was already there. And we had military forces who were working with indigenous special forces in that region to try and attack the problem. So that problem was there long before we went into Libya, and I would not want anything, you should not take from me that this administration wound up causing that problem. That problem was there. That doesn't say that the intervention there and arming and using locals may not have contributed to the current problem. I just don't think, I think the problem existed, I don't think it caused it. I do agree with what you said about anticipating secondary and tertiary effects. For those of you who have not sort of worked in government or done military planning, this is the most difficult. The phase 2, 3, and 4 is what it's called operations planning. It's how do you establish a new government in a place where there may never have been independent institutions from some sort of dictatorial, if you will, form of government. It's very difficult, and it requires a whole of government approach. And so we now have places inside the government that are responsible for that, because absent having people who are responsible for that, it falls to the United States military. That's both unfair, they're unmanned, untrained, and unequipped for that mission, but it falls to them because, by the way, it's a war zone and they're there. And I think we have learned that lesson, but it's going to take years to build the capability. So there's a place in the State Department that does civilian operations, that is sort of reaching out and providing capability in sort of new democracies, new governments. It's not nearly as well-funded or big as it needs to be, and as a result of that, there is still a burden on the United States military. But again, we must view that as part of a war planning effort. We must fund it as a war planning effort. Secretary Bob Gates, Defense Secretary, was the biggest advocate for State Department funding of any Secretary of Defense ever for just this reason. I think it is incredibly important. But as you think about it, those are the sorts of things in a budget-constrained environment people want to cut. The other piece to that, I think, is foreign military aid, foreign aid altogether. It's the USAID money that helps build political parties. We don't want our military assets doing that. But aid, people say, when we have such a problem with the economy here, what do we do in spending money to build political institutions or build law enforcement institutions overseas? The answer is we do that, and we must continue to find and use those dollars. It's a small fraction of the federal budget, because if we don't do that now, we wind up sending troops 10 years from now when it falls apart and it's a threat to us. And so we have to think, you're terribly tempted in a fiscally constrained environment to play a short-term gain, and that's encouraged because of our 4-year political process. We as citizens must force and discipline the system to think in a long-term game.
Thank you. Excellent. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, and thank you for your comments. Really appreciate that. After 9/11, the DNI was created, and it was specifically created to address the challenges of information sharing across agencies. Can you share with us the extent to which you think that the creation of that organization has in fact enabled better sharing, not only within the U.S. across agencies, but also internationally?
So you are absolutely correct, but the DNI, of course, by its very mandate, was limited to the 16 agencies of the intelligence community. They're doing better. I like to call it, it's like the secret handshake, right? They all deal in a classified world. They all understand the movement of classified information. They've enabled what's called a collaborative environment. So analysts who are doing Syria, I'm making this up, whether you're at DOD in the Defense Intelligence Agency or at Langley at CIA, can work collaboratively and share information. They can share taskings, they can share actual analytic product, they can produce it together. All of that is much better. It hasn't really solved. Their problems remain. We saw the Christmas Day bomber. By the way, that was CIA and NCTC. There are going to be hiccups. We're not going to perfect this, but it's much better. Across the federal government, this gets stickier. What the DNI has tried to do is say, look at what we've built inside the intelligence community, and instead of being a need to know sort of culture, we need to be a need to share culture. It's a better moniker than it is a practice at the moment. It's not as good inside the federal government across the agencies as you'd like it to be. Nidal Hassan, the Fort Hood shooter, is the poster child for this. There is no reason that DOD and FBI shouldn't have put more together prior to that attack. And so I think that's a painful reminder of how far we have yet to go outside the classified world. But I continue to believe that this is a cultural problem. People will find issues to hide behind. It's subpoenas and grand jury requires secrecy. It is, what about a Robert Hansen? He sits at the State Department as an FBI agent, he downloads Russian files. Well, that's an administrative problem. Bradley Manning, that's an administrative problem. Why didn't some system trigger they had downloaded all this material? These can be solved, but that's why I say I don't think the government all by itself, I used to call it the tyranny of the inbox. You can have all these ideas of policy issues you want to get to, but the thing that drives your day, in the West Wing at least, is your inbox, right? I got to deal with what's being thrown at me, and it's like in my spare time, that's like between 1 and 3 a.m., by the way, I can deal with kind of the long-term stuff. So the reason I've advocated for a thing like RAND for cyber is you need people who are outside the tyranny of the inbox to deal with these issues. On information sharing, I think it requires both. You need somebody in the West Wing, and I drove this. I had Kathy Lanier, the chief of police for DC. I brought all kinds of people, state and locals, in to talk to me about information sharing, and we issued the president issued a policy on it, because I believed it needed leadership so that the agencies then had the rules of the road that they were going to be held accountable to. I think we continue to need that, and I think this administration would agree with that. I mean, they've seen it themselves, the lessons of what happens when it's not, when somebody's not riding it.
Okay, Fran?
I think all of us in the room are holding our breath to see what happens in tomorrow. And that's one of the biggest issues on the table right now. I have a three-part question. Number one, are the sanctions working? And number two, it's been a dance between the administration and Israel to restrain Israel from attacking. We're all watching to see what happens. Do you believe that Israel will attack? And number three, what's the consequence analysis if an attack occurs?
Okay, my memory's not that good. Give me one. Sanctions working. I think sanctions are having an effect. I think they're having an impact, but this is going to sound a little flip, that the price of chicken is going up and affecting John Q. Public in Iran is different than saying they're effective. I think they're not changing the Iranian regime's behavior. That's my beef with it. I'm not saying we shouldn't have sanctions. I just don't think they're not going to save the day in terms of the second question. Do I think Israel will attack? My concern is I think Israel sees that sanctions, while having some impact, are not changing regime behavior. They also understand that their leverage is, second, I think they see that Iran has increased their activity in terms of getting a nuclear weapon. And third, they understand that the window in which they have leverage is up to our presidential election. forget who gets elected that day. Their leverage becomes less politically here in the United States as soon as that election's over. And so all those things will work to drive their decision. I think it's too soon to make the call, but I think if Israel decides to attack, it would be in the fall. I think that leaves it somewhere between September and November. I think they'll make the decision very seriously, and it may be that the administration has gone to extraordinary efforts. The exchange at the cabinet level from Secretary Panetta at DOD, Secretary Clinton, I mean, there's been extraordinary amounts of both political and military engagement with the Israelis to try and keep everybody on the same page. I think the Israelis have to factor in whether or not the United States will come in behind them if they choose to attack, because they run tremendous risks if we don't. And unless they have some degree of confidence, I think they will be reluctant to do it. But every prime minister of Israel has taken as his first order of business maintaining the existence of the state. And so if they feel an existential threat, that's what will drive them, not the U.S. reaction. Okay, that was 2. 3.
Consequence analysis of what it would look like if they did that. Because that minute job just 3 weeks ago said our goal is to annihilate Israel. So, you know, he's putting a lot of pressure on Israel to act also.
No, that's right. Look, there are multiple impacts, both economic and military, frankly. I think that if there was an attack by Israel, the likely immediate consequence of the Iranians will be to try and bomb the oil fields, which are all in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, just across the Straits of Hormuz. So that's why I think you see in Kuwait and Saudi and UAE, the U.S. authorizing a missile shield there. Because the easiest way to influence Israel is to have us to take out oil fields and impact the price of oil. So I think that's the immediate impact. That's also the reason people are very concerned about the Straits of Hormuz. But look, Israel's got the capability to launch Scuds with biological weapons on them in the direction of Israel. And I think even if we were reluctant to act on a sort of, let's call it an even playing field, right? Israel attacks Iran, nothing yet has happened, we are reluctant to go in. If Iran behaved in such a manner to use that sort of a weapon and to begin to attack Israel, I do think we would act. Now, I think it looks very different, by the way, when you talk about would we act militarily. Not every military action involves boots on the ground. Certainly it doesn't have to, and certainly it doesn't have to in the early phase. And so I think I would anticipate a naval-based air operation in the region. And I think that's the first thing that you would see.
Ms. Townsend, thank you very much for coming to the Syrian Hall for the Syrian facts. I wanted to keep my mouth shut, but since you encouraged us to ask questions. You mentioned about Saudi Arabia, and my question is about Saudi Arabia. Chris Van Dijk and Sultan, in the most probably work with knowledge and intelligence in chief. And of course, there was a rumor that he may have been insisting of 2 weeks ago. It's a strong rumor. My question is, based on your knowledge of him, do you think as an intelligence chief for Saudi Arabia, he's going to take a different approach to drive the swamp? Because 15 out of 19 terrorists of September 11 were Saudi citizens. Still, it's not the breeding ground. Still, it's a crater and a medical order, even avoiding Maghreb, financial leadership, something like that. What do you think that Chris Van Dijk and Sultan will do differently from his predecessor? And if you can comment on the line that Mr. Bob Woodward claimed in the book, Plan of Attack, that President Bush told Chris Van Dijk before telling Secretary Colin Powell about his decision to attack Iran.
Okay. Two questions. The question about the Woodward allegation that President George W. Bush told Prince Bandar, then the ambassador from Saudi Arabia to the U.S., about attacking Iraq before he told the Secretary of State. On that one, I would say to you, I can't really comment because I wasn't there and I didn't know. I didn't talk to. I never asked either person about the truth of it, so I can't really say. And the first question was Prince Bandar bin Sultan, the former Saudi ambassador to the United States on 9/11, had been here. He was the dean of the ambassadorial corps, the diplomatic corps, had been here for, I want to say, 25 or 30 years in the United States. He then went back to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, where he was made the National Security Advisor. That was a new role there, was never very active there. Saudi Arabia has two intelligence services. The internal service is called Mabahith. That was run by Prince Nayef. It's now by Prince Ahmed. That's the core counterterrorism force. They have an external service, the GIP, the General Intelligence Presidency. It was run by Prince Mukran. He was just removed and he was replaced by Prince Bandar bin Sultan. Prince Bandar is the son of the former crown prince, very powerful sort of piece of the Saudi royal family, speaks perfect English, was a fighter pilot early in his career, English educated, and known by every head of state around the world, has done tremendous, tremendous work. He had some health problems, and so he had been quiet for many years after leaving the U.S. I was over there after the death of Prince Nayef and saw his wife, who I knew from her time in the United States. The General Intelligence Presidency is both smaller and weaker, their version of CIA, much weaker than their internal service. Mabahith is sort of the equivalent of the FBI. It has never been terribly active. They don't have kind of the professional force of analysts and collectors that we associate with CIA. We had offered them some help in building their capability to be a more professional force. And I suspect that what you're seeing in terms of the change is concern on the part of the leadership of the kingdom with their external threats. Remember, for them, what they're worried about is Iraq to their north, where the Iranians have had increasing influence. Iran is across from their eastern province, where they have their oil fields, is not an ally. Yemen to their south, with al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, that was frankly al-Qaeda inside Saudi Arabia until they pushed it out and it went south. And so they have to be feeling pretty surrounded. And with the Arab Spring, remember Mubarak was a close ally, Ben Ali in Tunisia was a close ally. In fact, Ben Ali fled from Tunisia to Saudi Arabia. The world around them is changing, and the external threats that they see themselves surrounded by are huge. And so I think Prince Bandar appears to have the real confidence of the king. He has the connections around the world from his days in the diplomatic corps, and he's from a very powerful section of the family. And so I think this is really further indication of their concern and their renewed emphasis on the external threat.
Okay, so we will take one more question, Heather.
During your talk, you mentioned a couple of different threats which are cyber, maybe even smallpox, but you only talked about one adversary, al-Qaeda. So I was wondering if there were other adversaries, and what about homegrown terrorism?
Great. No, I'm glad you asked. No, I talked about al-Qaeda. It was the one I spent the most time on. But, few people realize that the Shia threat, right? Al-Qaeda is a Sunni Muslim group. The Shia, the other sect of Islam, the Shia terrorism group is Hezbollah. And Hezbollah was the group responsible for the Beirut barracks bombing back in the 80s. Up until 9/11, Hezbollah had killed more Americans than any other terrorist group in the world, and they've remained a threat. They're a threat not only to us, but they've been a threat around the world. They're responsible for the bombings of the Cultural Center and another facility in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And so we spent a good deal of time. They also had raised money here in the United States. And so they were a focus of law enforcement activity here in the U.S. And I think they will continue to be. I mean, Iran, when they feel threatened, tend to act through proxies, and Hezbollah is their proxy. They spend hundreds of millions of dollars arming them, training them, and supporting them. And so I think we have to be awfully concerned. One of the consequences of a potential attack on Iran will be their use of Hezbollah against targets around the world because they're already deployed. So I think that that is worth noting. The homegrown threat takes many forms. One of the Internet's had many blessings. One of the frailties it's identified for us is the ability to communicate, either command, train, inspire people. And it also, I mentioned, the Sikh temple, and I mentioned the Colorado shooting. One of the other things it's done is it's enabled people who are isolated, alienated, crazy, to feel like they all of a sudden have this like-minded community, right? And they can get an awful lot of information and inspiration off the internet. And because they're sitting in their basement or in their living room, it becomes much harder to identify them in this massive data that crosses through the cyber world. It's another reminder that, we worked pretty hard post 9/11 on this if you see something, say something campaign, and people understand what that means now. It also applies to people. It's not just the package that's left abandoned. There are particular characteristics of people who are alienated. Now, I'm not suggesting, I don't want people spying on their neighbors. It's not my point. But I think we do have to take responsibility in our schools and our communities to understand people when something's just not right. And I feel very bad for the University of Colorado because I think they're going through a real soul searching. I saw the same thing, by the way. I was in government and with the president when we went to Virginia Tech after that tragedy, and I watched them go through a real, very sad soul searching. Many of these one single individual in a free society bent on evil or destruction is near impossible to stop. But we have to understand and we have to be willing to take on difficult issues but where can we put in measures to make it easier to spot and more difficult for them to succeed? And whether that's got to do with our, gun laws or our psychiatric illness and identification and commitment laws, we've got to be willing to look at all of them. And nothing can be sort of the sacred cow. If we're serious about trying to identify and prevent these, we've got to be willing to address them all.
Outstanding, very provocative, intelligent, as you are always when you're on CNN. And I had a confession for Fran. I had to tell her that it doesn't matter. There are a few people in my house. It doesn't matter where I am in the house. If they're on television, my wife will let me know. And Fran happens to be one of them, and it's for good reason because you always say exactly what's on your mind. It's not about political correctness. It really is about what the truth is and what you believe, and we appreciate that. So what I would like to do, for those of you who have been here before and seen this, we certainly appreciate your time. You're one of the busiest people that I know at CNN, and I know quite a few. But thank you for your time. Thank you for your insight. On behalf of the university and CREATE, we'd like to present you with our Distinguished Speakers Award, and thank you for being here today.